asking the questions mainstream journalists will never ask. This is your Richie Allen Show on richieallen.co.uk, Fab Radio 2 in Manchester, and triggerwarning.tv.
How are you? You all right? Listen, thanks for your understanding yesterday. Never been one. I think it's the first time I've ever done it, actually, when I've decided, with no great reason, to take a morning off. What it is the future Mrs. Allen. Let's just say from now on in, my partner, Caroline, is 40 this week. She will be 40 on Wednesday. And my present to her was basically to arrange for her and her family and friends to have a bash in Nancy in the east of France on Wednesday. And she's going to be away for the best part of a week. So yesterday morning, with the weather being amazing and all of that, plus there was nothing in the Sunday newspapers except that bastard wedding, that blasted bollocks of a wedding. I said, well, sure, what are we going to talk about? There was nothing but the wedding. So I said, right, I'm going to go out in the sun, take a drive, which is what I did. Thanks for understanding and not getting too peeved off about that. Yeah. I have one thought and one thought only on that wedding. An observation I've made. I do not believe that there was as much public interest in it as the media would have you believe. I think a lot of the public interest in it has been manufactured. I really do believe that. I believe a lot of it was staged. I think the vast majority of people, I can speak for Manchester anyway, this great Republic of Mancunia here, where people didn't give an arse. They didn't. There was no bunting, no interest, no street parties, no nothing. I believe a lot of the interest in this is overhyped, overblown by the UK's media. Of course, the conduct of Sky News, ITV News and BBC News was disgraceful over the course of the week leading up to it and over the weekend. Disgraceful conduct. It was as far from journalism as you could possibly get. That's all I have to say on it. It's a farce, a charade, mind control across the board. Here you have this obviously very strange young woman, pretty or not, right, with a very weird background, claiming to be a feminist and then marrying into a family where she'll have to refer to her father-in-law as Your Highness and curtsy to him and do what her husband tells her and her husband's grandfather and all the rest of it. It couldn't be any further from feminism. That's all I'm going to say. Not that I have any interest in isms myself. Right, shut up, Richie, and crack on. A few things I want to get through before we introduce our first guest. And speaking of our first guest, I'm going to kick off with this story. I'm not going to talk about Iran or China and the US. We'll leave that for Scott Rickard later on, because Scott's always got some really interesting insights into these things. I'll leave that alone and we'll do a bit of a detour away from the main stories. Australian schools are thinking about abolishing the use of the terms boy and girl. This is not a joke. It's not new either. This has been spoken about for some time, but in the Australian mainstream press over the weekend, this resurfaced. Victorian councils, that's not Victorian as in the UK, Victorian, 17th century, 18th century, whatever. Victorian as in the state of Victoria. Their councils are responding to a study by Australian National University, which concluded that educators should avoid use of the terms boy and girl, and that's according to the Herald Sun, who also said, did the Herald Sun, that some of our favourite children's cartoons and children's television shows could disappear because of their lack of gender sensitivities or whatever the hell. Here is Sunrise News, breakfast television show Sunrise in Australia.
Victorian councils are reportedly considering banning children's books, toys or characters that don't meet strict gender guidelines. The Herald Sun says that some councils are auditing learning materials at libraries, schools and kindergartens and urging a ban on the terms boy and girl. The City of Melbourne Council is among several local authorities responding to new research about gender equality. Under the new guidelines, children's favourites such as Thomas the Tank Engine and Winnie the Pooh could be banned for not meeting gender tests.
Yes, ban Winnie the Pooh. Ban Thomas the Tank Engine. Which, if you remember, last year, or maybe it was 2016 maybe, the United Nations expressed concern about fat shaming in Thomas the Tank Engine because of the fat controller, who's a really important character in Thomas the Tank Engine. He's a character of authority, respected by the engines, by Thomas and Percy and Gordon and James. But he can't be called a fat controller. We've got to change that. This is not funny anymore. When I started covering this a few years ago, I thought it was hysterically funny, and I didn't really see the bigger picture at that time. It's no longer funny. This is deadly serious, and I'll be chatting about this with my guest from Sweden, in about 15 minutes' time. Yeah, ban Thomas the Tank Engine. Basically, this study by Australia University said that prejudice and gender lines can be recognised in children as young as 3 and 4. So Barney, presumably Sesame Street, everything is going to have to be changed. Councils even across Victoria are taking the study basically as fact. They're taking the study as law. Well, they're converting it into law and are reviewing their educational resources to make sure there are no gender stereotypical narratives. Talked about this on Thursday, didn't I? But I'm going to get into it a bit later on. German popular daily newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung fired its elderly cartoonist because he drew a caricature of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Right, fair enough. But there was a Twitter storm. These days, people's whole careers are being decided by judge and jury type Twitter storms. Yeah, what the cartoon portrayed was basically Netanyahu in the likeness of this Israeli singer who won the Eurovision Song Contest, somebody called Netta Barzilay. So the cartoonist, made Netanyahu look like this singer holding a missile in his hand, and the text above him said, "Next year in Jerusalem." It's satirical, it's funny, but no! Because the chief editor of the newspaper, Wolfgang Krach, he issued his apologies, but the 85-year-old cartoonist called Dieter Hanich, he said, "No, I'm not apologising." Sod that. And he was fired. Lovely. Some world we're living in now, where people you never met, people who don't live in Germany, can get you fired because they don't like what you think. Here's Gideon Levy. Gideon Levy is from the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Shall we hear him? Yes, we'll hear him. Shall we hear him? Yes, we'll hear him.
Whenever it comes to Israel, not only to Netanyahu, to Israel in general, immediately the European media is scared of being accused in anti-Semitism. While any other leader, you can do whatever you want. Whenever you draw an Israeli statesman, whenever you criticize Israel, immediately it comes up, oh, anti-Semitism. And Europe is afraid, really scared, paralyzed of being labeled as anti-Semite. Rightly so, by the way.
Rightly so, by the way. Fuck off, Gideon. Nobody should be paralyzed with fear. And you were doing so well there, Gideon, by the way. Speaking to RT. Nobody should be paralyzed by fear. Let's not say anything against Israel lest we be labelled anti-Semitic. Foolish thing for him to say. He goes on.
The only problem is that this has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And I hope that German colleagues in the German media will raise a voice of protest against this scandal of firing this cartoonist.
Yes, of course. He redeemed himself nearly in the end. Of course, the 85-year-old cartoonist shouldn't have been fired for what is an amusing and satirical cartoon. When will people wake up to the fact? And I'm talking about regular folk, not affected by this. When will they come to the realisation something is very, very, very wrong? When you cannot breathe a word of criticism against this pariah, murderous, apartheid state. Because if you do, you'll be targeted and you'll probably lose your job, as this 85-year-old cartoonist has found. Might try and get him on the show. See how we get on with that. More on Israel in the second hour of the programme. Here's one that'll drive you mad. This is in the Independent today. Hundreds of homeless people fined and imprisoned for begging and rough sleeping. Now, the Independent reports, and their figures are accurate, they are peer-reviewed figures, that the number of people sleeping rough in England is at a record high. There has been a 73% increase over the last 3 years alone. Hunger Games Society, anyone. And you know what's happening to homeless people? They're being fined, they don't have any money, I don't know what they expect of them, getting criminal convictions, and they are even being sentenced to prison for begging and for rough sleeping. I'll come to that in a second. 51 people have reportedly been convicted of breaching a public space protection order, which is called a PISPO or PSPO. 51 people for begging or loitering and failing to pay fines up to £1,100 since 2014. Hundreds of fixed penalty notices have been issued. We live in a madhouse, you see. This is a lunatic asylum we live in, where people can give a fixed penalty notice to somebody who is down on their luck, who is on their arse. Fine them £1,100. 50 local authorities have these PSPOs in place, these PISPOs, despite Home Office guidance at the start of the year telling councils not to target people for sleeping rough and for being homeless. A couple of cases that they mentioned in the Independent. A man was jailed for 4 months for breaching a criminal behaviour order in Gloucester. For what? For begging. The judge even said, in summing up, I will be sending a man to prison for asking for food when he was hungry. Right? In another case, a man was fined £105 after a child dropped £2 in his sleeping bag. That's insanity beyond where I can't even find words to describe it. A parent teaches a child we should be compassionate and we should help those worse off than ourselves if we can. Today we can, child. Give that man £2. The child gives the man £2. The man is fined £105. Mad, right? And we're going to see more of this, of course, as this system drives people into the gutter, which it is designed to do. 73% increase in rough sleeping in the last 3 years. Imagine what it'll be like in 2030. 17 and a half minutes past the hour. Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London, has announced late this afternoon that he is resigning from the Labour Party. The ex-London mayor, of course, as you know, has been suspended for nearly 2 years in a row over allegations of anti-Semitism because Ken made comments about Hitler and Zionism, accurate comments as it happens. Livingstone maintains today that he still will not accept that he was guilty of anti-Semitism or bringing Labour into disrepute, but he said his case had become a distraction for the party and its political ambitions. Jeremy Corbyn, who has basically thrown him under a bus, said it was a sad moment, but nevertheless the right thing to do. Yeah. Yes, the right thing to do, Jeremy. Somebody who's been a friend of yours since you were just out of short trousers has never said anything remotely hateful or remotely racist about Israel, but you're happy to see him go because you've got designs on winning the next election. What a lovely man. Ken said he abhorred anti-Semitism and was truly sorry that his historical arguments had caused offence and upset in the Jewish community. There is so much wrong with that, Ken. Don't apologise to these tyrants, to these lunatics. What you said was a fact, a historical fact. Leave it at that. Leave it at that. And shame on you, Ken, for resigning and making it easier for Corbyn and Shami Chakrabarti. You should have made them fire you. Or, excuse me, he wasn't working for the Labour Party. You should have forced their hand to make them bar you from the party. Dreadful. Dreadful. Last week, speaking of Chakrabarti, Shami Chakrabarti, she called for his expulsion last week, which signalled to, I suppose, Labour Party supporters that the leadership had turned against him. Shami Chakrabarti, the greatest pain in the arse since the advent of the tetanus shot. What a horrible person. What a clown. Ken Livingstone. And on the Gaza massacre last week, Israeli officials announced on Friday that they will completely refuse all cooperation with any UN probe into the Nakba Day murders of 61 Palestinian protesters. The Israelis have said, we don't care. A UN Security Council resolution failed to agree on the investigation because it was vetoed by the United States. The UN Human Rights Council, by the way, doesn't need or doesn't have to worry about vetoes. The UN Human Rights Council doesn't need permission to investigate. It held a special session and it has agreed to send investigators in, but the Israelis won't cooperate. They might not even admit the investigators into the country. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. 21 minutes past the hour. This is your Richie Allen Show live on Fab Radio 2, TuneIn Radio, richieallen.co.uk and triggerwarning.tv.